Hey, what's up? This is J.R. Martin from Underdog Press, and I'm here with part three of our discussion on steampunk. Sorry this video is a little bit late. I had some things going on last week, but I'm here to finish this up so we can continue talking about steampunk and then move on to other genres and talking about some of the characters. What really excites me about this part is the fact that this is where my story resides, right? So it's steampunk, but it's a Western steampunk, and this really excites me because it is what I'm writing. It is what I'm doing right now, and that is what really excites me. So, just a real quick intro or a recap of what we talked about before. We've talked about steampunk in the very beginning. We just what steampunk is as far as gears in progress. Then we talked about London, steampunk in Victorian times. So now we're talking about the Western steampunk. The idea that there's more than one way of doing steampunk, and although the Victorian era is where most people usually write it, it's still the 19th century. Western still took place in the 19th century. A lot of times people forget the Victorian era and the some of the Wild West. The Wild West wasn't as long as you would think it is, but the Wild West, the idea of the Wild West, happened actually at roughly the same time. It takes the same 19th century technology and drops it in a world of dust, grit, and wide open spaces. And this changes the setting fundamentally from what it is when you're talking about Victorian steampunk. Think about it. Victorian steampunk is about resisting rigid social classes, but what is Western steampunk about? At its essence, it has a lot to do with the Westerns, and Westerns tend to be kind of like that man versus wild, the edge of the frontier and people exploring it, and as they explore it, they're slowly, I hate to say it like this, but they're slowly destroying the frontier that they are known for and loving. It's like the more they do the thing that they enjoy doing, the less of that frontier is going to be there, right? There's a bunch of shows, bunch of places that say, space, the final frontier, that type of thing, right? So it kind of gives you an idea when there's a disappearing of the frontier. Um, that's kind of what Western is about. So it's about man versus the wild, or man versus the environment. The West, there's a bunch of progress. It's not a factory hidden away in the city. That's not where the technology comes from. No, the West is about, exploring, finding new resources and sending them back east for those to be processed there. It's about the environment. And so what's crazy about that is a lot of times it's not about what they're doing there in the West as far as how they're building the factories, how they're building the tech. It's about how are they taking the technologies that they have? How are they finding ways to integrate the brass, the steam, and all those different items into the world that they live in as they continue to explore the new frontier of the West and find more resources to send back to the East, and then the East pumps out new technologies, making it easier to explore the West. So think about it in that aspect. They're working towards civilizing the frontier, but that's still a long, ongoing process. So, as a writer's tip, when you're talking about steampunk technology, make your technology feel a little bit out of place, especially in the West. It should be a constant, noisy, polluting struggle to keep these intricate machines working in a world of sand, dust, and scarcity. Your characters aren't just fighting outlaws, they're fighting rust. They're fighting for a clean gasket, a single bucket of water, a spare cog, sorry. Survival is the name of the game. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the engineer's apprentice here because that's kind of what the engineer's apprentice is. In a nutshell, it is a situation where you have man versus wild. What's interesting about this is, when we talk about man versus wild, especially here in the US and the Wild West, a lot of times we have to talk about manifest destiny. And what's cool is that these characters, the Native Americans actually in my world, they actually have stopped manifest destiny because they've been able to find magic. And here's the what I think makes this a little bit more sustainable. Because typically steampunk is about, or Western steampunk is about man versus the environment. What if the environment is fighting back a little bit? What if the environment, I said before, it's a character. What if the environment is actually trying to actively protect itself from being destroyed? And what if they have their avatars, the Native Americans in this case, actually actively helping to prevent its destruction? Then you get into this weird situation where in my world you kind of have a stalemate between magic and steampunk technologies. And that's what's really cool about the Engineer's Apprentice is that there is a dichotomy between it's this man versus environment, but you get to see an environment that's also pushing back against mankind. So you do see the pollution in Dallas, Texas, where the story takes place, majority of the time because there is a disease going around as they work to fuel the steam technology. The miners that are helping supply some of the resources necessary to allow this technology to function are getting sick. So that is part of the story. But and that's one of the major themes. Is that industry versus nature, that unforgiving frontier, and like I said, in the case of the Engineer's Apprentice, what happens when the frontier fights back? Part two of this is going to be the self-made machine, right? So lawlessness and individualism. So the Wild West is already known as a place to be lawless. It's already known as a place where you had rugged individualism, man's man, mano a mano, fighting each other with guns, those sorts of things, right? So what happens then when you see the steampunk in this environment? Think about it like this, right? So, as I said before, you have the rugged individual, the lone hero, the man with no name. Steampunk amplifies this. Think about it like a lone inventor can defend the farm from a gang of bandits. If she can build a steam powered turret, a single outlaw can rob a heavily guarded train. If he has a clockwork arm and a stick of ether dynamite, or whatever other technology that is uh, showing up in your steampunk world. Unlike in London, where technology is mass produced in factories, technology in the West is DIY. It's scavenged, jury rigged, and deeply personal. It's made of scrap iron, wagon wheels, and broken train parts. So when you think about that, there is a lot of jury rigging when there's steampunk in the West, and there's a lot of DIY aesthetics. One of the reasons why Issa appreciates having Annie around is Annie is although she's an engineer and she's a sword maiden, she's also a blacksmith. She's a woman of many talents. But because she's a blacksmith, she's able to fabricate things. And so when Issa comes up with these new ideas, hey, let's try that. Annie's the one that goes into her forge, sits down, beats on some metal, and then brings it back and say, Issa, I have made this. And so that is one of the themes that I actually do make sure to talk about in my story. And I really believe that this is super important when you're talking about steampunk in the West, right? Steampunk in the West really does have a lot more of that DIY, that loner feel to it. So even if you're writing characters who are somewhat like, I'm trying to think of, what was that? Is it Maverick? I think it's Maverick. The card shark. Um, yeah, I think it is Maverick. So let's think about characters like that, like Maverick, where the gambler in the Wild West, right? Uh, you focus on a DIY aesthetic where this is a writing tip, where this person is, has some sort of personal technology. So let's say they're a card shark and they have a card changer in there, like a steam powered card changer in their suit that allows them to quickly change cards. Like I said before about blacksmith pounding the metal out to create new technologies. Once again, it's not precise, it's not pretty, but it gets the job done. And that's one of the big things about steampunk in the Wild West. It doesn't have to be refined, it just has to get the job done. It has to do the thing. And so what that ends up doing is creating a situation where the people that you're dealing with could actually have a lot more power than they normally seem like they do, right? The As I mentioned before, with the woman who builds a turret in her backyard to protect her family, imagine the level of destruction that she's able to cause now, or and being able to protect her family and her farm out in the Wild West because she had the technological know-how to be able to build this thing. Imagine, if you would, situations where the um, the the steam engineer is building technologies on the fly to solve problems at that moment. This is not some ready-made solution that they can just get off the shelf. This is something that they're like, hey, I have the skills, I have the talent, I have the rugged individualism to take care of this right now. So that's what steampunk in the West is about. It's about those types of things, about being able to handle those situations on your own. The final theme of steampunk in the West is, reinventing the Western myth, reinvigorating it, right? We talk a lot about different shows, movies, ways of reinvigorating the West, how Star Wars is a Western in space, how Firefly was an obvious Western in space. We talk about these things a lot. We should lean into those a lot more, right? Reinvigorating the Western, I think, is a great idea because it does have a lot of that rugged individualism. It does have a lot of that lone gunman, lone hero that can kind of swoop in, take care of business, and then ride out. I had the pleasure of writing a story back in the day with Cat Rambo called Riders of the Endless Void. And it was a Western set in outer space. I love Westerns, and just being able to write that Western and then work on these steampunk Westerns, it's very fun. It's exciting. And I really enjoy doing this because I used to like Westerns as a kid. So what you're doing here is you're reinvigorating the Western. You're adding life to a genre that has so much left in it, right? Because the idea of the West is about man versus the environment, industrialization of the frontier. That is what the West is about, and there's a lot of ways to do that. And steampunk actually allows for that a lot more because it does allow for you to, steampunk does lend itself to having rugged technologies, right? So we're talking about not having that refinement of the Victorian times, but being more rugged. And steampunk allows for that. It allows for both. In fact, you could have a situation where you have somebody dealing with Victorian times and steampunk from Victorian times moving to the US, and then all of a sudden having to deal with steampunk in the Wild West and seeing the difference in those two technologies. Like, wow, it's the same steam powering both of these, but it's used in two completely different ways, right? So that's something else that you can explore when it comes to steam powered technology. So these are just a few ideas and a few tips of ways to explore steampunk and not always choose Victorian themes and elements. Once again, the Western is also just one of many. You can have steampunk in Japanese culture, you can have steampunk in any other culture across the US, or like I've said before in previous videos, build your own culture world where steampunk is the predominant way of doing things, and then just kind of have your own way of making that happen, or in your world and with your own culture. So I just want to go ahead and end this off. This isn't going to be as long as some of the other videos because this is kind of wrapping out everything in a nice neat bow. And like I said, I don't want to get too much into, well, I do actually want to talk a little bit about my work, but I don't want to give away too many spoilers because, when you're thinking about the Engineer's Apprentice, when you're thinking about the Engineer's Dilemma that'll be coming out soon, those stories are actually going to be very steampunk focused, very Western focused, and you're going to be able to see what I'm talking about these things, about these rugged individuals. Issa, a rugged steam engineer. Annie, a rugged engineer. Issa having to think of solutions on the fly using magic and steam together. Annie having to be able to build solutions on the fly to satisfy Issa's needs, but also to save their lives in some occasions, right? Because that's what she does. She's a blacksmith, so she's able to fabricate. Issa's the magic user, so he can kind of combine magic and steam into one thing to be able to get them out of trouble. The two of them work together to be able to make these things happen, and that's the beauty of it. Is you get to see how two different types of people deal with this frontier that they're a part of, and you get to see how the frontier fights back and what happens within the frontier, as the frontier is kind of like, nah, you're not going to just come in here and push your way in and take over everything. No, I'm gonna fight back. I want to be here. I want to live here. I want to remain wild. I want to remain free. Like I said, in this instance, the environment is kind of like uh, one of the characters. So let's recap everything that we've talked about so far. Victorian steampunk is about social conflict, upward versus downward. Western steampunk is more about environmental conflict, man versus wild, industry versus the environment, and the frontier. From the foundations of progress to the smog of London to the dust of the frontier, the themes of steampunk are what give the aesthetic its power. It's a genre of contradictions, hope and despair, order and chaos, nostalgia for a past that never was, and fear for a future that might be. For us writers, steampunk is a gilded cage, a beautiful, intricate lens to examine our own world, our own progress, our own class struggles, our own relationships with technology, and our own untamed frontiers. The brass and the goggles are the wrapping paper, but the themes, the hard questions about progress, humanity, and justice, that's the gift you give your reader. Once again, especially in Western steampunk, we talked about how it's about the lone gunman. Well, imagine in Westerns, it's always the lone gunman seeking justice for the downtrodden and the person who's trying to bring the civilization to the frontier. But justice is also key in Victorian steampunk. We talked about the detective and how the detective is an integral part of the Victorian steampunk in maintaining order and maintaining the status quo. So get into your workshop, pull up your keyboards, sit down, pound away at those keys, and start tinkering with new stories that involve steampunk themes and ideas. And remember that if you want to talk about more about societal issues, you can create your own world or stick with the Victorian. Or if you want to talk about, steampunk invading the frontier, you can go ahead and do a steampunk western, or once again, create your own world where those are the themes. And especially create your world if you're trying to explore the themes of societal differences between the upper class and then the frontier steampunk, and how it's used across those two areas. So, happy writing. I hope you enjoyed this series, and I will be back next week with a new series. Peace.